I think one thing that's very important to remember about the Egyptian revolution, the Arab Spring in general, is that first it was a bottoms-up movement and not a top-down. There were opposition parties in Egypt, but they were not the ones who led or inculcated the revolution. They responded to it like many other factions, but it was actually sort of hatched via youth that were not politicized, those on Facebook, those in the cafes, those that were in some political movements. But for the most part, it was a populist, bottoms-up revolution. The other thing is that, as we mentioned, this wasn't about religious ideology or political ideology, as many of the revolutions we've seen, at least in the 20th century, have been. It wasn't even about a class struggle. I can reassure you that in Tahrir Square we had as many people driving Mercedes as those that had to walk from distant villages. This wasn't the French Revolution, a class revolution. This wasn't the Iranian Revolution, a religious revolution in which Khomeiniism replaced a secular monarchy. This wasn't the Russian Revolution, a political ideology motivated, a communist revolution replacing what was seen as excesses in capitalism. This was a revolution about human rights and civil rights. This began as a response to the police brutality that did not respect the dignity, security, and physical space, physical well-being of citizens. This was about the economy. This was about having a future. The last point I'd like to make before we turn it over to the question and answer session, and I have the rare privilege as a moderator of telling you that we're exactly on time. We should be able to finish just in time with 15 minutes of Q&A as we were asked to do. The last point is that we need to understand here in the West that the Muslim majority world and the Arab world is not inherently or even in any way anti-Western in the sense of being anti-Western culture or anti-Western citizens. Not only have we as Americans, as an American government, limited our policies to the Middle East to the three things I mentioned, resources, Islamism, and Israel, we've also failed to understand that the antagonism that comes out of that part of the world towards us is directed at the government, and particularly its foreign policies, and not against the culture or the people. And I can prove that to you. If you consider just the facts on the ground, a culture or a place in which you have fast food chains that are American, people sitting there getting pizzas and burgers, the clothes that are worn are essentially Western clothes, the movies that are watched that are playing at the corner cinema, the music that is being heard, the interest and the knowledge and the depth and the nuance of information that's there about us that we don't reciprocate about the Middle East or the Arab world. If I were to reverse this just to make it clear and say, imagine if in Chicago or in America or in any Western city, it was very normal for us to walk around in galabiyas and bulghas and kuftans and the type of clothes that are worn in some parts of the Arab world. If we had food and ta'miyya joints, Arabic food at every corner, it was very normal for us to see Ma'moon or Ammu Husni, those type of chains. If we had Arabic movies playing in every corner cinema and playing on our television sets, if we all aspired, and many of us knew the Arabic language, imagine then if one could make the case that we're anti-Arab. It would be ludicrous, or that we had a problem with Arabs or Arab culture. So I think the point is clear. We have exactly 15 minutes on the dot for a Q&A session. I ask that if you have a question that you line up in the middle so that we actually have turns. So please make your way towards the middle of the aisles to ask your questions and direct it at a particular member of the panel. And as you walk up, I'd like to take this moment to thank our distinguished panelists for their time and for their remarks. And I'll begin with you, and then we'll go right back to the line. I understand that you have. Mic is not on.
That mic is not on.
Socialism and capitalism, because there are many democracies that have quite a bit of socialism in them. I would say most of Western Europe has a lot of socialism. So I do not see that this is a proper pairing. And I felt quite disturbed that he felt that after military imperialism hadn't worked in these areas that well, that he now would like to see a lot of cultural imperialism. Thank you.
Would you like to respond to that?
I was just suggesting that we have the ability to do good things as well as bad, and that we should use our soft power. We should try to be helpful with exchanges.
Can you pick up the mic?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's on.
I may have been misunderstood by the questioner. I was not arguing for more American armies in Muslim lands. I was arguing for American, particularly American citizens, much less the U.S. government, trying to be helpful in this important change underway in the Arab world through exchanges, through volunteer opportunities, through teaching, through all kinds of different people-to-people approaches.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Buller, thank you for your wonderful analysis of the winds of change in the Middle East. Although you did allude to historically to the Turkish situation, may I request you to please put in context the recent changes in the Turkish foreign affairs and their more assertion on the international scene, and also vis-a-vis the European Union, if you would please.
I was talking about the relationship between the civil and the military arms in Turkey. The current Turkish foreign policy things, I think, relate much more to the shift from an EU-oriented Turkish vision to one that sees Turkey as playing a role in the Middle East again, and I don't see any huge difference between the civil and the military in making that shift.
This question isn't directed at any particular member of the panel, partly because it seems that whatever topic they were talking about, this question or this issue seems to come up, and every panelist has spoken about it. I think almost every panelist has, and that's Islamophobia. So the question I have is, you may have heard that the Center for American Progress recently came out with the report titled "Fear Incorporated: The Roots of the Islamophobia Network in America." And it shows very plainly that there is a very well-funded network of right-wing organizations funding this. And as Professor Khan mentioned before, since Muslims are they're not a demographic or a political threat in this country, it almost seems sort of unimaginable that there would be this kind of a Islamophobic sentiment. And Professor Boulier, I know you touched on this a little bit, where you were talking about how radical Islam is pitted against Israel. And I was wondering what role the Arab-Israeli conflict may play in this issue of Islamophobia, whether it's sort of a continuation of that conflict by proxy, by turning it into sort of an ideological battle versus a territorial dispute. And if so, what implications does this have for the nature of the Arab-Israeli conflict? Or what changes, understanding this, then what changes would Muslims in this country have to make in terms of how the strategies for countering Islamophobia, since it is turned into an ideological battle? Thank you.
Yeah, the growth of Islamophobia, I had expected it to taper off after 9/11, and the fact that it has grown, exponentially is interesting. And I think that when you have something like this, there clearly is a network of publishers, of supporters, and so forth and so on. Dan Pipes was once a student of mine, so I'm perhaps guilty of the whole thing. I introduced him to Islamic history. But I think it has as much to do with Christianity, or more to do with Christianity, than it does with simply trying to radicalize U.S. sentiment on the Israel-Arab axis. The evangelical Christian vision that the United States is called upon by God to permanently and support Israel in anything Israel does, which is a view that's been expressed by a number of candidates for presidential nomination in the Republican Party, I think is very deeply felt in that community, and that's a very, very large community. And I think that the notion of supporting Israel has gained traction and has contributed to the Islamophobia in Christian circles, in some ways more than the issue of terrorism. In other words, the issue in current Islamophobia seems to be less, they hate us because of our values, they attacked us, blah, 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 so much as it's an evil religion. It's the religion of Satan. I mean, it's really metastasized in a particularly ugly way, and I think that it calls for concerted religious responses and should not be simply seen as a offshoot of our traditional Israel-Palestine dilemma.
I just want to add two other issues or points to that. I think the report points out to the fact that because the American Muslim community is not yet a political threat, is young and developing, is mobilizing, does not have the same resources as other competitors in the market, let's say, because it is vulnerable, that Islamophobia in that report shows that it's possible to feed. But what's most important is, from that report I receive is that the little resources that our organizations have, if you occupy them doing this, then they can't occupy doing other work and services for their organizations and for the community. So Islamophobia, as much as it's, it's horrible and extremely deeply concerning, it's meant to replenish the really resources that we have in the community, and to be obsessed with this and fight those resources, the competitive resources. The other thing that we should think about from that report is that while it may come across as, oh, American Muslims are not the threat or do not have the resources, it's important that it does say that coalition building is the key, nationally, locally, as well as internationally. Islamophobia is not just contained within the boundaries of North America, but we see it in the attacks that happened in August, right, in Norway. So it's something that one has to address as a global phenomenon.
Let me just add a brief point here. I'm itching to respond to this as somebody who monitors and studies Islamophobia for a living. Let me tell you this. There's a lot of projection going on. Almost everyone, every pundit out there that is propagating the myth of a Sharia takeover in the United States probably believes in some level of Christian Sharia takeover in the United States as a solution for the United States to move forward. Secondly, I would agree that there is an effort to make the territorial conflict in the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, into a larger ideological conflict here in the West, to disenfranchise Muslims or Muslim Americans, and we see this every time. I was just appointed, as others were, to the Illinois Governor's Muslim Advisory Council, and immediately the blog started trying to say, oh, it's Hamas, it's Hezbollah, it's the Muslim Brotherhood taking over. The reason is they don't want Muslims in places of power or influence because they believe that this will affect negatively, adversely, the lobbying efforts towards the state of Israel by Zionists in this country. So there is, if I were to tell you the two main groups, I don't like to generalize and I'm not generalizing, but the far right generally is a place in which Islamophobia is rampant, and particularly the far right evangelical movement and the far right Zionist movement. Both have a wedding or a marriage of convenience in terms of propping up Muslims and Muslim Americans to break them down for different political and ideological purposes. Next question, please.
My question is respectfully submitted to any or all distinguished speakers. A recent Pew Research study has shown that the largest single religious group in the present-day world are Sunni Muslims, 1.4 billion, plus 200 million Shiites, followed by Catholics, 1.2 billion, Hindus, 935 million. And the Muslims consider two sources, every Muslim, as the sources of guidance, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him. That's why we call ourselves Sunnis. Why the Western scholars divide or want to divide us into extremists and moderates, while the same Afghans who were fighting the Russians and trained by our own CIA and were called freedom fighters, now we dub them as terrorists.
Anybody would like to?
During the Cold War, anyone who was opposed to the Soviet Union was our friend. I recall Mr. Khalilzad, the ambassador, an Afghan who was an architect of the support of the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. He brought a delegation of Mujahideen to Colombia to speak, and I said, don't you realize that these people whom you are bringing around on lecture tours to talk about the great fight against the Soviet Union are more extreme than the people in Tehran whom you will not talk to because they are such terrible fanatics? And he said, well, yes, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. And we got to that bridge on 9/11. It was a perfectly understood situation that we could not live with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan if they won, but we never thought they were going to win. And it was one of the most hypocritical things, in modern American history, or in American history really, to encourage the Afghans to die for freedom, and then to walk out on them when it turned out that their notion of freedom wasn't our notion of freedom. So it was a sad story.
We're coming very close to running out of our official time. I will break when we are told to, so I apologize for anybody that's been standing. Let's take 2 questions in a row and try to get everybody in. The first 2, please.
I would like to thank for the wonderful analysis comparing to Turkey. I'm from Turkey, so I've lived all that through. My question basically is for Turkey. For us, it took about 50, 60 years to get the amount of demilitarization that's needed. I was wondering what would the factors be to accelerate that demilitarization for the Arab countries? Do you think there are factors like that, or it will take another 50 years for them also to get the same amount of demilitarization?
Dr. Grand, I really liked your quote where you said hour of the citizen in the Arab world. I was struck when you said that by the fact that, just as I was been following Twitter today, the same activists that I was following, both that are here in the United States as well as those everywhere in the Arab world who were tweeting about the Arab Spring, were also tweeting about something that was happening in Wall Street on New York City today about sort of like an uprising that was occurring, people who were sort of coming, citizens who were speaking out. I remember reading when in Madison, Wisconsin, when there was the standoff between the governor and the labor unions, where the media was using the term of the Arab Spring in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm just curious to what degree you find that sort of a dynamic. Sort of, we're talking about the winds of change, and a lot of what's being said is sort of from here, from our vantage point, what can we do there? I'm curious, with that wind coming the other direction, what you might say about how that relates.
I'm sorry, let's take the last question from Imam. You've been standing there, and then we'll have to end the questions. I apologize.
Briefly, a quick comment. I'm very excited about what we're doing right now. Last year and this year, and I hope we continue. Because for years, we've been looking for avenues by which Muslims can be able to discuss issues like this with, stakeholders, so we can actually be able to impact policy. And this, to me, is a very strategic position, and I hope the Secretary General will take this and it becomes a continuing effort of the OIC, even when you're no longer in the office, that this will continue, because this is a way by which Muslim Americans are being empowered. The second point that I want to make is, in looking at what happened in Libya, the first victims that they took and began to persecute were Africans who were in Libya. And when I look at this forum, most of the time when we talk about U.S. policy, Africans south of the Sahara are usually not being included. So I hope we expand our focus next time. And when we talk about the Muslim world, we don't just look at Asia and the Middle East, but we also think of, because the underwear attempted bomber, so Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let me just say a brief word about the Turkish military question. I think it will take about 50 years to get the Arab military officer corps out of the economy. It is going to require new people recruited into the military academies who are going to have to rise through the ranks. I mean, unless there is a government strong enough to simply put large numbers of colonels and generals on the retirement list and risk a coup, you're going to have to wait until you have a new generation coming up. I think since the military has so rarely been really talked about, people aren't aware, for example, that, I'm not sure now, but there was a time when in Turkey, you had a 3-year grade school curriculum in which so many hours each year were spent indoctrinating Turkish youth into the greatness of the military. I mean, it really, the way in which the military is operated in these neo-Mamluk states needs to be revealed and needs to be dealt with internationally as well as within the new regimes that are coming into being.
With regard to the question about the hour of the citizen, the credit for that phrase goes to the late Sir Ralph Dahrendorf. I can't claim credit. I do think that we live in a globalized world, and what happens in one part of the world greatly affects what happens in others. And you do have these moments throughout history where publics all of a sudden tend to play a larger role, and what happens in one society empowers people in other societies to take greater control over their lives and over their governments. That said, that kind of power can be ephemeral and often runs up to the realities of power politics. In Egypt, I think the big question the day after the elections will be, does the military go back to its barracks, and on what terms? And certainly those who sacrificed in Tahrir Square will want this revolution to continue to be theirs and will press hard. But there's the reality of a military that's very powerful and that controls a lot of economic interests, so stay tuned. In terms of contagion effect elsewhere in the world, will those winds of change blow back here? I think the winds of change of Obama probably had some impact on what people saw happening here in our election, probably had some effect on people's perceptions of what they could do in the Arab world. I think an interesting question will be, what do these revolutions mean for countries like Iran, for Russia, and for China going forward? I think that will be interesting to watch.
I would go back to my original point that what's unfolding in the Arab world, Middle East, and North Africa, I think we still need a great deal of self-education and understanding and analysis of what has happened. And as even the last 2 weeks, what we've seen in Egypt with its population taking over the Israeli embassy, all of these different changes, I think, need further analysis and understanding before we can say, can that change be applied to other local protests. And I think it would be pretty important to really study how civil unrest and resistance can really strengthen our national and local communities as well as our organizations. So those are the only 2 points I would reiterate.
I want to thank our distinguished panelists not only for their informative discussion, but also for being very on time and helping me keep this session on time. And I want to thank you for being here and listening to us. Warm round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, of course, Ahmed Rehab, for a great job moderating this discussion. Thank you very much.